wrap it all up with a look at failures to replicate, some very important psychological papers that were found to not replicate and what that means. So now let's take a look at failures to replicate. So this is something that has become actually much more important in the last, I'll say 3 years, I think it's been, maybe a little bit longer than that. But very recently, psychology went through a massive replication project. So this replication project was meant for exact replications of big psychology experiments. So they wanted to do exact replications of psychology experiments, and labs across the world were basically given different psychology experiments to do literally exact replications of. Go to the method section, do it exactly. What they found is that 2/3 of these studies did not replicate and or had weaker results. So a large portion of them just failed to find the effects that they found before. And then a large portion of them, if they did find the effects, found them to a much weaker degree than they found before. So this was failures to replicate, and this basically indicated a replication problem in psychology. So this is from a report that came out about this attempt. And the ones that are in bold are successful replications. The ones that are not in bold are unsuccessful replications. And you can see that in terms of successful replications versus unsuccessful replications, successful replications for this analysis, 54%. Only 54% of the psychology studies were successfully replicated. And when you go to a higher p-value for the sample size, that goes down to 50%. So in this case, you can see that there is this difficulty issue in doing these replications. So we're going to talk about a few failures to replicate that were known about even before this replication issue, before this replication problem. And we'll just discuss those so that you're aware of those. But when something doesn't replicate, that is a big red flag that the phenomenon itself is not real. So the analogy for this is the person that makes a basketball shot. So I don't think we got to this slide in the previous lectures, but let's just say that you are in a basketball court and you're there with your friend. And your friend takes that basketball, and your friend throws the basketball up in the air as hard as they can. And it goes off the scoring board, and it goes off the backboard, and it hits the court, and it lands in the seats, and it bounces back onto the court, and it bounces into the basket. And your friend is like, I'm the best basketball player in the world, right? There are two possibilities that are evident. Number one, your friend is the best basketball player in the world, and can just hit any shot at any time and should be in the NBA. What's the second possibility? What was that? It was a lucky shot. So whenever there's a successful experiment, there's always that probability. It's either yes, the experiment is real, aka your friend is the best basketball player in the universe, or the result is lucky, aka your friend had a lucky shot. So if you're on that basketball court and your friend is like, I'm the best player in the universe, it's again either true that they are or it's luck. How could you test it? Have them do it again. You basically just give him the basketball again and say, do it again. And if he throws it up in the air and it goes off the scoreboard, and it goes off the backboard, and it goes off the court, and it goes off the seats, and it goes back onto the court, and it goes back into the net, then you're like, oh my gosh, you replicated your result. It must be true. You must be the best basketball player in the world. If, on the other hand, they throw it up in the air, it goes off the scoreboard, hits them in the face, they get knocked out, then you're like, well, it was lucky the first time. Same thing with psychology. We do these replications because the way that psychology is built, the way science is built, is that any result could either be true or lucky. And one of the best ways to discover between those two is to just do that experiment again. So these are going to be some failures to replicate, which again indicate that these results here may not be true. These results may only have been due to a lucky bounce in the experiment. All right, so the first one we're going to take a look at is Barge et al. Automaticity of social behavior, direct effects of trait construct and stereotype activation on action. So this is that paper right there, 1996. This was a huge paper. It's very highly cited. You can read about the details. I think it's in your Canvas supplemental articles. But what the main finding of it was that if you prime people with an elderly stereotype, that actually makes them walk more slowly. So what they would do is they would present people, for example, with lists of words. And these lists of words would either just be your average regular words, or they would be associated, much like the words in our list, they would be associated with the elderly stereotype. So they would be words like frail. There would be words like gray. There would be words like early bird special, left blinkers always on, nobody turns it off, right? So they asleep at 5 p.m., right? So they would have those elderly stereotypes. They would prime these university students with this elderly stereotype. And then what they would say is, they would say, all right, thank you very much, the experiment's over. And as the students were leaving the lab, they would have somebody in the hallway time how long it took them to just walk down the hallway. So they thought the experiment was over, but they were timed how long it took them to walk down the hallway. And what they found was that if you were in the group that was primed with the elderly stereotype, you slowed yourself down. Your body was slower than people that were primed without the elderly stereotype. So this was a huge finding. So you can see the citation count on this. I mean, Roediger and McDermott was high. This is like through the roof. And this is actually a few years ago. It's probably cracked, at least 4,500 by now. But that's the citation count. Absolutely massively influential paper. And its importance, it started the idea of priming behavior, embodied cognition. It started the idea of, I don't know if you've ever read research on power pose, about how just kind of like standing like this can make you feel more powerful and will make you more assertive. That's embodied cognition. The idea that our bodies are also part of our minds, right? So our mind does not stop at the brain. Our mind includes our body. And actually our mind also includes the environment. That idea that your mind is just your brain is a very limited way. But this was one of the big important papers that started that, so that you could actually prime behavior. You could subtly prime behavior. You could get embodied cognition. So priming of behavior, just recently, if you take a look at elections, right? People prime ideas in elections. So the Trump administration, when they were doing their talks, when they were doing their campaigns, they would use the word invasion a lot. They kept using the word invasion here, invasion there, invasion there. Even if they weren't talking about immigration, they would use the word invasion. They were priming people to think about an invasion, so that when they talked about immigrants, you were cognitively prepared to say, yes, I'm thinking about invasion, so it must be invasions. And that kind of leads into this idea of stereotypes as well. We're just prepared to kind of believe the stereotypes. And it was one of the first kind of findings that kind of boosted this modern wave of these automatic and unconscious priming processes. So it's hugely important, but as it turns out, it's probably wrong. This is probably not a real effect. We're not at all accusing anybody of forgery or unethical behavior, but just like your friend that threw that basketball and ended up scoring the hoop, this was probably luck. This was probably a false positive, because people have actually published failures to replicate. There's actually 3 published failures to replicate for this study. And one of the things that historically has been true, not so much anymore in the last, very recently, like 3 to 4 years, but historically, you could not publish failures to replicate, because failures to replicate can mean one of two things. Either this finding here is false, or you've made a mistake, right? There's two sources of failure to replicate. So the fact that these are actually published means that probably 100 manuscripts of failures to replicate were submitted for each of these. So these three probably represent 300 failures to replicate. It's just very difficult to publish a failure to replicate. So you can see that this here, this priming effect, probably, most likely not true, not the case. At least priming you with the elderly stereotype will not activate elderly behaviors. All right, any questions on that one? All right, let's take a look at two more. We got Snyder, Tank, and Berkshire, 1977. Social perception on interpersonal behavior on the self-fulfilling nature of social stereotypes. So this is this article right here back in 1977. And what they did was they set up a situation where you were going to interact with another subject, but you were going to interact over the phone. And what they wanted to know is they wanted to know, does your perception of other people affect your interpersonal behavior, right? So oftentimes for example, in our entertainment, friendly people are typically depicted as beautiful people, right? So you take a look at movies and everything, the hero is always usually a beautiful person, the friendly people are usually beautiful people, but the evil witch, I don't even have to say evil ugly witch, probably ugly witch is already in your mind, evil people, not so nice. So the idea here was to find out, is it the fact that good-looking people, attractive people are just nicer people, right? Maybe just being good-looking in the world just makes you a nicer person. Being unattractive makes you not such a nice person. Or is it how we perceive and interact with other people, that expectation that leads to this feed-forward loop? So what they did is they brought in subjects and they had them communicate by phone. So you never saw your co-subject, right? And there were two real subjects, but you never actually saw them. So they would set you up in one booth, and they would set the other person up in another booth, and you would initiate a phone conversation. And before the conversation began, the experimenter would just kind of casually let slip either that the person you're talking to on the other side is just really attractive. Right? So they would say something like, oh, I saw the person you were working with, and man, they are good looking. Anyways, have fun with the experiment, right? So they would just kind of give that an aside, or they would indicate that they're unattractive, right? And then what they did was they just let the conversation flow. After that, they had independent raters rate the conversations for friendliness. So they just said, here's two people talking. How friendly is this conversation? Here's another two people talking. How friendly is this conversation? And what they found was that physical attractiveness stereotypes created that self-fulfilling prophecy. If you thought the person on the other end of the phone was more attractive, you were more likely to have a friendly conversation. And if you thought that the person on the other side of the phone was unattractive, you were more likely to have an unpleasant conversation. So friendliness was caused by that activation of those attractiveness stereotypes. So people were friendlier to those that they believed were more attractive, and then that itself feeds forward, right? So think about your interactions. If somebody comes up to you and says, hi, how are you doing? You would probably respond with, pretty good, how are you doing, right? You would have a nice, friendly exchange. But if somebody came up to you and said, hey, what's your problem? You dumb something. You probably wouldn't be sitting there going, oh, I don't actually have a problem. How are you, right? You respond negatively. So what they found was that if you thought somebody was attractive, you would be friendly to them. That in turn would make them friendlier to you. That in turn would make you friendlier to them, and it would just feed forward. If you thought they were unattractive, you would be subtly unfriendly to them. That in turn would lead them back to being unfriendly to you. That in turn would lead them back to be unfriendly to them. And it's this feed forward loop. Citation count, probably at around 2,000 right now. At the time, 1686. And again, the importance, this was a hugely influential study from the 70s, and it's fit nicely with the ideas of the power of stereotypes and your bias and judgments to actually create reality, right? So when you're taking a look at stereotypes based on race, when you're taking a look at stereotypes based on sex, a lot of times that actually, the stereotypes a lot of times have sort of factual bases in them. Not factual bases, they actually have evidence in them, right? You actually will see that, the stereotype of, let's say, women in the workplace. If one of the stereotypes for bosses, female bosses in the workplace, is that they're bossy, right? I should say female supervisors in the workplace, is that they're bossy. The question becomes, are women actually more bossy? And the answer here is that in actuality, yes, they are. They actually will be more bossy. Why? Because of that self-perpetuating stereotype. So imagine that you had an employee. Imagine that I was an employee. And I had that self-fulfilling stereotype about female bosses. And I just felt that they weren't capable, and I felt that they were overly bossy. And that was my stereotype for a female boss. What's going to happen when my male boss comes to me and says, I'd like you to file these reports? Are they going to have to ask twice? No. I'm going to say, okay, yes, sir. I'll take these reports and I'll file them. And I'll file those reports because I have the stereotype of the male boss, and I'll be like, oh, he's really direct and very reasonable. If a female boss comes and she goes, I need you to file these reports. If I have that stereotype of female bosses not being very good at their jobs, if I have that stereotype of female bosses actually being bossy, I might take those reports and I'll say, yeah, I'll get to it. So she comes back later and she's like, are those reports filed? And I'm like, not yet, but I'll get to it. She's like, well, I need them filed. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll get to it. So she comes back a half hour later. She's like, are those reports filed? And I'll be like, I'll get to it. Well, notice, she actually is being bossy because the male boss asked me once. Once is not bossy. The female boss has asked me 3 times. 3 times is bossy. And still not done. She's going to have to ask me a 4th time. So the question is, are females more naturally bossy? Probably not. I don't have the data on that. But has his behavior made her more bossy? Yes, it has. He's literally brought out bossiness from his female boss because she had to ask him 4 times. That's literally the definition of bossiness. So this really fit with that kind of narrative of the effects of stereotypes and bias and its effects on behavior. And it kind of, like you can see, I mean, it led to massive amounts of work, but kind of unbelievably, they failed to replicate it. People could not redo this experiment and get the same effects. And once again, they've actually published failures to replicate this. People have tried to redo this, and it seems that this is actually not true. This was, again, a fluke result, doesn't actually occur. All right, and then the last one that I'll mention, this one you've probably heard of before. This is Rosenthal and Jacobson, 1968, Pygmalion in the Classroom. I highly recommend, even though it didn't replicate, read this experiment because this one is reported so often in textbooks. It's been distorted so often in textbooks, and one of its key findings is never mentioned, and it's been buried. And I'll mention what that is, but just real quick to get to it. Pygmalion in the Classroom. This was a study where psychologists told teachers that half of their students were going to be blooming that year. We've done a psychological study, and we can tell you half of your students, man, they're going to excel this year. The other half of your students, going to be average. And what they found was that at the end of the year, the students that were identified as ones that were going to excel, they did amazing. The students that were identified as being average, they didn't do amazing. Unknown to the teacher, there was no difference between the students. So it was just the teacher's reaction to the exceptional students and the teacher's reaction to the average students that brought about the excellent learning goals of these students and the not so good learning goals of the other students. So that was the main finding, that teachers' expectations are self-fulfilling and they actually cause student achievement. Citation count on this one, you can see it's hugely influential. It's in educational textbooks everywhere. You've probably heard it from more than one source just here at IUSB. And it was the first study that demonstrated that these expectations can be personally self-fulfilling. That if you have biases against people, that's actually going to impact how those people perform. But and it was used to explain inequalities of race, class, gender, in school achievement, in just general life achievement. But there are just tons of failures to replicate. And if they do replicate it, they find out that the effect is very, very, very small. Now, just real quick. So has anybody ever heard of this study before? I see a few people nodding. So usually this is what's reported, right? Usually this is the what you'll find in textbooks, that the teacher's expectations are self-fulfilling. But I find, more importantly, there's a buried result, and that has to do with the teacher's opinions of the students. So you can group these students into four categories. There were the students who should do well and actually did well. There were the students that should do well and did not do well, right? So the ones that were identified as exceptional, there were those that actually ended up doing well, and some of them didn't do well. For the ones that were considered below exceptional, there were actually ones that did well. They beat the system. And then there were ones that didn't do well. They asked the teachers to rate which of those students, the personalities of the students, which ones were rated the least positively, which ones were rated as having the most attitude, which ones were rated as being the most troublesome. Any guesses out of those four groups?
The last group, one's supposed to do well and didn't do well.
That is not the correct answer. They were not rated very poorly. So the ones that were supposed to do poorly and actually did poorly, teachers didn't think that they were the worst group of the bunch. Which one?
The ones that were rated poorly but did good.
The ones that were rated poorly but did well. They were the ones that teachers thought had the worst attitudes. They were the ones that teachers thought were the most abrasive. They were the ones that teachers thought were the biggest problems. And it kind of crushes your soul a little bit, because you would hope that these teachers would be like, oh, well, wow, what did this person do? They weren't supposed to do well, but look at them now. They did amazing. I really like this person. It's not true. You don't like the person. And I find it hard to believe that that got buried in a study that's been cited over 5,000 times, especially now that issues of gender and issues of diversity are coming to the forefront. And one of the expectations that people have is that female bosses will not do well, right? Black bosses will not do well. People that were typically not in these positions of power, they're not there for a reason, is what a lot of people believe. So when you put them into that position of power, they expect them not to do well. And you would hope that a woman that was placed as a CEO, and everybody looked at her and said, oh my gosh, well, there goes the company. And she takes the company to its best earnings, in the last 10 years. You would hope that they would be like, you know what? I was wrong about her. And I really like her, and I think this is being great. This study says that instead of that, they said, she shouldn't have done well, but she really did well. She's really bossy. I don't like her at all, right? Because it's just the reactions that they have. But anyways, this part, failed to replicate.